Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more esoterica. Today we are diving back into the works of Mr. Rudolph Steiner. This is an outline of occult science. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material and the link from my book where I teach you to do magic responsibly, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of an outline of occult science with, I think we're on part 3 of chapter 4. And once again, this is an exceedingly long chapter. We will not be getting done with it today. We are only barely getting started with it. I am not going to stop and talk about the different aspects, right? I do not believe that we came from Saturn or an evolution of Saturn. I do not believe that there is much difference between the astral body, the etheric body, and the corporeal body, and the body, soul, and spirit. It is different ways of describing the same thing. We've already hit that twice in this chapter quite extensively, so we will not be doing that anymore. Even when it pops up, I'm going to try to refrain myself from making comments upon it. And this is going to start off with it, so there we go. The physical body is the oldest of the present 4 principles of man's being. It is also the one which, in its way, has attained the greatest perfection. So the physical body is more perfect than the spiritual body, and it is older than the soul, right? The body is older than the soul. That's what you're telling me? Yeah, no, that is not right. The soul is the individualized spark of divinity, which is you, right? The part that has been portioned out for you in particular, and that part existed prior to your incorporation. Therefore, it is older and it is more perfect, even though it does have amnesia while it is here. And while we are incorporated, we don't remember the before and we don't know the after, but both of those are inside the scope of the soul, and therefore the soul is going to be more perfect than the body. Now, that's not even the gross material world, right? I don't believe that mess either. And so, yeah. Occult research shows that this part of man already existed during the Saturn evolution. It is important to remember, and this will be the only time that I pointed out this particular round, occult research means that someone saw it in their mind's eye, which means that they almost certainly created it. They were looking for something. They found exactly what they were looking for, and that is not at all unusual. So, once again, that is something that is almost certainly not true. Right? It's not that it is impossible, but the only independent corroboration is people imagining it. That is not going to work. It will be shown in the following account that the form taken by the physical body on Saturn was, of course, something quite different from the present physical body of man. The earthly physical human body, from its nature, can only exist by being in connection with the etheric and astral bodies and the ego in the manner described earlier in this book. All right, last time. Once again, what he described is a possibility, but it is only a possibility. It is not at all certain that that is what is. As a matter of fact, there is significant reason to believe that it is not. There is zero difference between the soul and the ego, and he has those differentiated. The ego is the part that makes the decisions for the temple. The soul is the part that makes the decisions for the temple. Both of those are the exact same thing. And so this separating it into 4 is absolutely incorrect, at least as far as my understanding goes, right? I do try to remain speculative and teachable, but that is one of the things that I am pretty firm upon. There is no difference between the ego and the soul, no matter who is trying to tell you differently. Such a condition did not as yet exist on Saturn. The physical body was then passing through the first stage of its evolution without having a human etheric body, an astral body, or an ego incorporated in it. During the Saturn evolution, it was growing ripe for the reception of an etheric body, and for that purpose, Saturn had eventually to pass into a spiritual condition and then be reincarnated as the Sun. During the Sun incarnation, the physical body developed again to the stage that it reached on Saturn as from a germ brought over, and only then could it be interpenetrated by an etheric body. We will hit on this because it is something that we have not hit on in this particular study. There is an alternative solar system diagram, right? We work on the Copernican model, which is the sun is in the center of the solar system and everything revolves around the sun. There is an alternative to that, and it is not geocentric. It is the Tycho's model, and the Tycho's model had us with two suns at one point. One was dimmer and one was brighter, and then the brighter one burned out. The brighter one was Saturn, or it was Jupiter. I'm pretty sure it was Saturn. Right, I'm not heavily read in on the Tycho's model. It does appear to work. I'm not going to leave the link, but you are welcome to look it up. It's Tychos. And it gives a different interpretation of why the planets are moving, and it gives, in my estimation, a better interpretation of the retrogrades and the various things associated with the planetary motions. But the central point of that is that there was a binary for our solar system, that Saturn and the Sun were both luminous at some point, but that Saturn lost the luminosity at a point and the Sun became the sole sun. At that point, from the understanding that we have, which is fragmented and not all that reliable, right? It is folk tales from way back in antiquity, but that at this point in time, there was a great reconfiguration in the sky, and that the current sun became the primary and Saturn dimmed. There is record that it happened. It is, again, fragmentary and not all that reliable, but if the Tycho's model is true, then what is recorded is pretty much exactly in line with what you would expect from that particular model. And so there is a reason to believe that there was at one point Saturn as the primary sun for our solar system. Now, that is, again, well back into antiquity. It is well back, fragmented with no reliable, so it is in the realm of speculation, but it is recorded and there is reason to believe that it may be true. And this sun incarnation, that absolutely can be something and just misinterpreted, as is often the case when dealing with esoterica. Back to the text. By means of this incorporation of an etheric body, a change took place in the nature of the physical body. It was raised to a second stage of perfection. A similar thing took place during the moon evolution. Man's ancestor, as he had developed himself when passing from the sun to the moon, incorporated in himself the astral body. As a result, the physical body was changed for the second time and thus raised to its third stage of perfection. At the same time, the etheric body was likewise changed and passed to its second stage of perfection. On the earth, the ego was incorporated in man's ancestor, now composed of the physical, etheric, and astral bodies. Thereby, the physical body reached its fourth stage of perfection, the etheric body its third, and the astral body its second stage. The ego is only now at its first stage of its existence. If we give ourselves up to an unprejudiced examination of man's nature, there will be no difficulty in acquiring a correct idea of those different stages of perfection of his separate principles. I will point out that there is nothing in this chapter so far that has been an unprejudiced examination of anything. It has been with a foregone conclusion that every single speculation that has been brought forth has been presented. It has been presented as true and not as speculation in every single case, and therefore it is not unprejudiced. For this purpose, we have merely to compare the physical with the astral body, because that is a thing that can be done. It is true the astral body, as a psychic principle, stands on a higher level of evolution than the physical body, and in future ages, when the former has been perfected, it will be very much more consequence to man's complete being than the present physical body. You just told us, like just now in this video, you just told us that the body was the state of perfection and the other ones were added on, and therefore this cannot be true. Right? This cannot be true if the body was the first, which you just told us, as the perfected, and it has become more perfected, even though it was perfect, which makes absolutely no fucking sense whatsoever. There is no such thing as more perfect, right? It is either perfect or it is not, and perfect is not attainable here. There is nothing perfect about the human body, right? It is very well engineered, but it is a lost system, right? So, once again, inconsistency, major problem, right? This is an inconsistency. He just told us the body was the perfect, right? It was right up here when we haven't even gone that far, right? The earthly, where was it? There it is. The physical body is the oldest of the present, like at the beginning of this video, right? The oldest of the present four principles, and it is one, has attained the greatest perfection. Now, in its way, is a qualifier, of course, but like that is the intimation that the body is the perfect, and it is getting more perfect as it goes along. And this is something completely different from what was just stated in the last section. And so, once again, inconsistencies within the same chapter causes enormous problems. See the Bible study. Yet, in its own way, the latter has reached a certain degree, high degree of perfection. Consider the marvelous wisdom with which the structure of the heart is planned, the amazing structure of the brain, nay, even of part of a single bone, such as the upper end of the thigh bone. In the end of this bone, we find a network or scaffolding, wonderfully constructed and composed of delicate spicules and lamellae. The whole is arranged so that, with the least expenditure of material, the most effective action on the joint surfaces is obtained. Hence, the most efficient distribution of friction and a proper freedom of movement. Thus, wise arrangements are found in the parts of the physical body. And if we go on to observe the harmonious cooperation of the part with the whole, we shall find that it is certainly true that this principle of man's being is perfect, and it does not affect the question that in certain parts something apparently useless appears, or that disturbances of structure or functions may take place. It will even be found that such disturbances are in a way only necessary shadows of the wisdom-filled light which is poured out over the whole physical organism. Now, compare with this the astral body as the medium or vehicle of pleasure and pain, desires and passions. What uncertainty rules in it with regard to pleasure and pain? How the desires and passions, of which it is the scene, run counter to the higher goal of man. How senseless they often are. The astral body is only now on its way to attain the harmony and inner poise already possessed by the physical body. Similarly, it might be shown that the etheric body is certainly more perfect in its own way than the astral, but less perfect than the physical. And it will equally result from a corresponding study of the ego that this, the real kernel of man's being, is now only at the beginning of its evolution. For how much has already been accomplished of its mission, that of transforming the other principles of man's being in order that they may become a revelation of the ego's own nature. The result of an outer examination of this kind is intensified for the occult student by something else. It might be pointed out that the physical body is attacked by diseases. Now, occult science is in a position to show that a large proportion of all diseases owe their origin to the fact that the perverse actions and mistakes of the astral body are transmitted to the etheric body and, indirectly through the etheric, destroy the perfect harmony of the physical body. It is certainly true that you can manifest things into your life, This is something that I emphatically believe. This is something that I do not even couch in equivocation. This is something that is true. And you will focus, or you will bring into your life that which you focus upon. And so if you are focusing upon good health, that is almost certainly going to be the outcome. And if you are focusing on not good health, that is almost certainly going to be the outcome. Now, there are some equivocation to that, in that there are bottlenecks in your life that you have to pass through, you have agreed to, and regardless one way or another of what decisions you make, they will unfold in some manner, right? My broken leg is the example I use most recently. I was given advice to avoid it. I did not do so. The event had to take place. I have learned great lessons from that I almost certainly would not have learned without the situation. And so while I did not manifest this physical ailment into my life, it was part of my spiritual development that I have it. And so there are things that will come into your life which are not your desires, right? But if you are one of these people who are, for instance, a hypochondriac, and you are constantly looking for what will be wrong with you today, then you will certainly find something wrong with you today. Not every disease, however, is linked to that. And that is what this is saying, right? This is saying that the physical limitations that we face aren't because of some predetermined plan of things that we have to go through, but rather every single one of them is the result of an action. And that is not necessarily true, or even likely to be true. Again, there are things outside of yourself which have been agreed to, and sometimes those things are physical ailments. I know that is a hard concept to wrap your mind around, but it is an experience that the divine cannot have for themselves. All of that is to say that it is entirely possible to create within yourself some disharmony that will destroy the perfect harmony of the physical body. But at no point in time, no matter what, is your body in perfect harmony. It is at all points in time proceeding towards death, even from the moment of birth, right? Even from the moment of conception. The end of that is death. The body is constantly changing in a way that will lead to death, regardless of your situation, regardless of how you take care of yourself, regardless of what you put into your body, regardless of your circumstances. You are going to die. Therefore, the body will never be perfect. And it's not meant to be. The living forever, definitely overrated. Right? I'm already tired of most of it, and I'm not quite 50. I mean, that is not to say I'm tired of life, but there are definitely parts of it that get annoying. It is possible to manifest negativity into your life that does include physical ailments. People do it all of the time. But it is not the only reason why, right? And even this mechanic of it happening does not necessarily have to be true. We have already discussed that his divisions are not necessarily as accurate as they probably could be, right? There is the division, but it is not into 4. And so the pass-throughs are intrinsically not going to be correct either. It is an assumption that is made, and that is not that unbiased, unprejudiced viewpoint that he was talking about, but rather looking at it with the already predetermined idea that it is this thing, right? And that does not necessarily make it true in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. Back to the text. The deeper connection, which can here be only hinted at, and the true cause of many of the conditions of disease, elude that kind of scientific observation which confines itself solely to the facts obtained by the means of physical senses. I will also point out once again that germ theory was brand new, right? This was around the time of World War I. World War I was when we discovered a lot of things that are detrimental to the human race, right? We discovered phosgene gas, we discovered mustard gas, we discovered all kinds of really horrible things that we used on each other, right? And so through the lens of history, we have an understanding that they didn't really have then. This was brand new. There was no virology, right? They were just coming to the understanding of what a bacteria even was, much less how it can affect your life. And so there were great things that Mr. Steiner just did not know because it was not known. And some of the things that lead to sickness is definitely one of those things, right? Sickle cell anemia is not a thing that people understood. And I know that is a minority of the population, but it is an example that is readily available. Cancer, not really understood. If it produced a growth on the outside of you, okay, but if it was on the inside, you just died of natural causes. Nobody knew what cancer was really. Heart disease, Alzheimer's, like all kinds of things. And so, with that bearing in mind, sometimes the explanations that are given are not necessarily the explanations that should be given, especially if you were missing great swaths of information, which was absolutely the case. And so while there was, again, some sicknesses, it did not mean that you created that sickness. Right? The Black Plague was not because somebody wanted it to happen. The connection in most cases come about in such a way that an injury to the astral body does not cause manifestations of disease in the physical body in the same incarnation in which the injury takes place, but in a later one. Once again, karma is a thing, debt and obligation is a thing, but it is not an intrinsic one, right? It is almost certain that this is not true. I mean, except in some extreme cases of circumstances where you didn't learn the lesson, and in that particular case, you agreed to it prior to your incarnation, right? You are not bound in this way. It's just simply not a thing. And I know I try to couch that normally with a bit of equivocation, right? But I am 99.9% on this, right? What happened in your previous life absolutely does have some bearing in what you have in this life, but not to the degree that it is understood in the Far East at all. Most of that does appear to be a control system meant to hold certain people back and to push other certain people forward, and it has been extremely effective for thousands of years, so it is understandable why they maintain it, but that does not mean that it is true. I mean, the fact that you have cancer has almost nothing to do with your previous existence. It has maybe more to do with your current one. Right? Lung cancer from smoking cigarettes does exist. Getting thyroid cancer from eating the wrong things does exist, right? There are ailments that you can give yourself by consuming the wrong things or not consuming the right things. Scurvy, right? There are things that you can manifest into your life. That does not mean that it is a karmic debt in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. I do believe that there are lessons that we do not fulfill in every single one of our incarnations, but there is no reason to believe that debt carries over. Right now, if there is a lesson that you did not learn, you can choose to relearn that lesson. That is not the same thing as karma requiring you to learn that lesson. And again, that is speculative. Everything is speculative when dealing with the eternal, but there is significant reason to believe what I stated more so than what they stated. I mean, and I don't care. Again, I do not care at all how long something has been written down. We did a whole 162 videos where we showed that just because it has been written down for a few thousand years does not make it right at all. And if you're confused, that would be the Bible study. Hence, the laws now under consideration have a meaning only for one who is able to admit that human earth life is repeated again and again. But even if deeper knowledge of this kind is rejected, ordinary observation of life makes it plain that human beings indulge in far too many pleasures and desires which undermine the harmony of the physical body. Really? Pleasure gives you disharmony. Now that is entirely possible. It is entirely possible to overconsume things that give you pleasure. But it is not intrinsically bad to consume things that give you pleasure. There is nothing wrong with having sexual intercourse. There is nothing wrong with eating fine and luxurious foods. It's not a lifestyle that you should put into play, or else you might get gout and you might get diabetes. But it's okay to enjoy some ice cream. It is okay to have sweets. It is okay to have sexual congress with somebody. It is okay to eat meat. It is okay to eat sugar. It is okay to do most things in life in moderation. And so, it is true, indulge in far too many pleasures will undermine the harmony of your physical body. Pleasures are an intrinsic part of the harmony of the physical body, and denying yourself pleasures will undermine the harmony of the physical body just as much as giving in too much will. Life is about moderation and making the appropriate decisions with the information available to you. And the information these days is pretty complete. That is not to say it is fully complete, but we have a lot more information than Mr. Steiner had. We do know about nutrition. We do know about exercise. We do know about things. I mean, we know things that hurt you, and yet people do them. And so there is possible to have far too many pleasures and desires, but there is also possible to have far too little pleasures and desires, and neither one of those are intrinsically good in and of themselves. Back to the text. And the seat of pleasure, desire, passion is not in the physical but in the astral body. Prove that. The latter is still so imperfect in many respects that it is able to destroy the harmony of the physical body. And that is, again, it's not untrue, but it is not true in the way that it is being relayed. It should also be mentioned here that such explanations as these are by no means intended as proofs of the assertions of occult science about the evolution of the four principles of man's being. The proofs are drawn from spiritual research, which shows that the physical body has behind it a transformation enacted 4 times into higher degrees of perfection, and that man's other principles have been perfected to a lesser degree, as has been described. It is desired merely to indicate here that these communications made by spiritual research relate to facts, which are visible in their effects even to ordinary observation, in the degrees of perfection reached by the physical body, etheric body, and so forth. If it was possible, without spiritual sight, to see the etheric body, then we could discuss this. Right? There is no ordinary observation of the perfection of the etheric body. Right? You will not be able to clearly see that. You will not be able to see the astral body. Right? Not with your physical eyes. There is the whole spiritual observation, which I do not entirely discredit, but I do discredit in large part because what you want to see is what you will see. Right? This unprejudiced presentation that we're getting here is something he wants to see, and therefore he sees it. And so, right, you can see perfection in the human body, right? An athlete who has honed himself, that is perfection in the human body, at least as far as we can attain it. But there will be drawbacks to that as well. So everything has its pluses and minuses. Communications made by spiritual research is, again, just entirely in your imagination. And this, unless it is verifiable outside by outside people. Back to the text. If we wish to draw an approximately true picture of the conditions prevailing during the Saturn evolution, we must take into account the fact that while it lasted, there were virtually as yet none of the things and creatures existing which now belong to the earth and are included in the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms. The beings of these 3 kingdoms were formed during later periods of evolution. Of all the earthly beings physically perceptible today, man alone existed in that time, and of him, only the physical body existed as described. But there are at present belonging to the earth not only the denizens of the mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdoms, but other beings as well, not manifesting in a physical embodiment. Such entities were also present at the Saturn evolution, and their activity on the Saturn scene of action brought about the subsequent evolution of man. If the organs of spiritual perception are directed, not to the beginning and end, but to the middle period of evolution of this Saturn incarnation, we find there a condition which consists principally of heat. Nothing is to be found composed of gaseous, fluid, or even solid constituents. Really? There was nothing existent of a gaseous, solid, or a liquid. Really. But there was heat. But there was no solid, liquids, or gas to transfer that heat from one space to another. That wasn't a thing. Thermodynamics didn't happen. It wasn't necessary to have a medium of exchange in order for there to be an exchange. That wasn't a thing. There was heat existent, but there was no air. There was no land. Now, once again, I do believe that there was a period of spiritual evolution. I believe that when God limited himself into the finite and became the spirit, all of the elements came into existence at that moment. None of them were combined. That is the absence of heat, right? That the beginning was the complete absence of heat. It was null space, right? All of the atoms in existence, but none of them moving or joining or forming compounds, right? A flash, a picture taken of that moment of transition from the infinite into the finite. That's the beginning. And then God said, I am the light, and he became the light, and the light was good, right? That's how that played out. He spoke, the word became the motion of the universe, and everything started moving. And then we got heat. But at that moment of heat, all the elements were already in existence. There was already something to transfer that heat. And so, at least in my estimation, this is some bullshit, right? Nothing is to be found composed of gaseous, fluid, or even solid constituents. Therefore, there could not have been heat transfer. There could not have been heat. There was no source of heat. There was no transition or change to make the heat. Every instance of heat is the transfer, right? It is something changing from one to another, right? Even if it is not any physical level, right? If you make tea, for instance, you have to take a liquid, water, and you have to heat it up almost to boiling. If you get to boiling, it's really past that point. And so between 0 degrees and 212 degrees, there's a lot of variation in fluid, right? But this transitions, right? As it gets less heat, it'll transition into a solid state, and as it gets more heat, it'll transition into a gaseous state. But until there is change, there is no modicum, right? If there is no medium for the exchange of heat, there cannot be an exchange of heat. That is one of the reasons why I insist that space is not the vacuum that we assume that it is. It is simply a spatial thing that we don't like. The space between the elements is stretched more than we are used to in our magnetic emanation here. And so it's not empty there. It's just kind of pulled tightly, and there's less room for that movement. But if you put heat into space, it will disappear rather quickly, which means that there is probably a modicum of exchange. And if you send a signal out into space, it will be carried, and therefore it has to be carried in something. We receive emanations from the sun, and therefore those emanations have to be carried through a medium. And so all of that implies that there is gaseous, fluid, and even solid constituents if there is heat present. Hopefully that was clear. Right? I do happen to know a little bit about thermodynamics. I did go to ACNR school, and I did graduate it. Even though it did me no good here in the real world. That was the military school, and they only train you on half of the job. So all these states appear only in later incarnations. Let us assume that a human being with the present organs of sense were to approach the Saturn conditions as a spectator. None of the sense impressions possible to him would confront him there except the feeling of warmth or heat. Suppose such a being approached this Saturn. He would only sense upon entering the space occupied by it that it was a different degree of heat from the rest of surrounding space. but he would not find that portion of space by any means equally warm throughout, for warmer and colder parts would alternate in the most complicated manner. It's not all that complicated, actually. There are laws that govern it, and we can intuit how it will go. Radiating heat would be felt along certain lines, and not only straight lines, but regular figures would be formed by the variation in heat. Something like a cosmic being, organically constructed in itself, would be discerned, appearing in changing conditions and consisting only of heat. It is difficult for a man of the present day to form an idea of anything consisting only of heat, for he is not accustomed to think of heat as something self-existent, but as a perceptible quality of warm or cold, gaseous, liquid, or solid bodies. Yes, because people in the present day apparently have a better idea of what heat is than you do. And I'm not meaning to be an asshole about this, but this is one of those things where I can definitely be an asshole about. This is a complete not understanding of how heat works, and yet trying to explain it to someone as though they don't know. To one who has adopted the physical conceptions of our time, it will seem particularly absurd to speak of heat in the foregoing manner. Yes, and that is not just physical conceptions, right? I do have spiritual conceptions. They do overlap. He will perhaps say, there are solid, liquid, and gaseous bodies, but heat only denotes a condition assumed by one of these three bodily forms. No, heat is the modicum of exchange. Right? You cannot make something cold. You can only remove heat from it, and there has to be a mode of exchange for that to happen. Like, this is like the first rule of thermodynamics. You cannot remove, or you cannot add cold. You can only remove heat. And so you do not have an idea. If the smallest particles of gas are in motion, the movement will be felt by heat. Where there is no gas, there can be no movement, consequently no heat. No, because there can be heat exchange between solids. It is a little bit more difficult because there is a space between the solids, and therefore there is some air there, but you can butt things up together and have a transfer of heat between those things. To him, to an occult investigator, the facts appear differently. To him, heat is something of which he speaks in the same sense as he speaks of gases, of liquids, and of solid bodies. To him, it is simply a still finer substance than gas. Now, heat is the manifestation of plasma in transformation. Like we've talked before, right? This is plasma being transferred. The plasma that existed before was butane. The plasma that exists afterwards is composed of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and several other elemental combinations. The modicum of exchange, which is happening, is the butane comes up, it hits a flare, it gases out, the spark lights the change, and then the change occurs, and therefore we get heat from the exchange of the physical transformation from butane into the other elements. That is activated plasma. That is the transfer of heat, right? It is also the creation of heat. Heat is created by the change from one gas into other gases. It is also present if there is an electrical discharge and a change of electrical stimulation. It is only through change that we achieve heat. Heat is not something that is created. It is, however, existent, right? We do have heat, and plasma exists in both its states, the inactive, the lighter. Like if I don't create the change, then it just comes out and it remains exactly the same. But if we have the spark of change, that allows the plasma to transfer from one thing into another, creating heat during the transfer. That is how heat works. And so there is a still finer substance than the gas. It is the electromagnetic connections of all of the elements, and that transfer of energy is what makes the activation happen. And so this is in part correct. It is still a finer substance than gas, right? It is the plasma, which is the connecting pieces between the individualized elements, right? It is all of the elements and the space between them. And so the activation occurs in the space between them, right? One element loses electrons, another element gains electrons. That is an exchange of heat. And gas to him is nothing but condensed heat. Okay, we ain't even dealing with that. In the same sense that liquid is condensed vapor or a solid body condensed liquid. Thus, the occultist speaks of heat bodies just as he does of bodies formed of gas and vapor. Not if he has intelligence. If we are to follow the spiritual investigator into this region, it is, however, necessary to admit that there is such a thing as psychic perception. I do admit that. However, with a caveat that most people who participate in it are imagining it. And that is not something I'm even going to equivocate about, right? Most of the people who participate are finding exactly what they are looking for. In the world, as it presents itself to the physical senses, heat appears entirely as a condition of solid, liquid, or gaseous bodies, but that condition is merely the outward appearance of heat, or the effect of it. Physicists speak only of this effect of heat, not of its inner nature. Let us try, then, to leave entirely out of consideration any effect of heat received through external bodies, and to realize merely the inner experience which comes from saying the words, I feel warm, I feel cold. That inner experience is the only thing capable of giving an idea of what Saturn was during its period of evolution described above. It would have been possible to pass right through the portion of space it occupied. No gas would have been there to exercise pressure, no solid or liquid from which light impressions could have come, but at every point of space occupied, one would have felt inwardly, without any external impression, here is such a degree of heat. How is this guy a doctor? All right, so, no. Just no. No. If there was no perception, right, if you did not have physical senses, then there is no perception of heat. You would not be able to feel it if you did not have the ability to feel, right? Now, can there have been light without heat? Kinda, but not even really, right? And so this whole thing just falls apart because of reality, right? I understand spirituality and reality for many people are not the same thing, but for me they are, right? The spiritual only is like the physical describes how the spiritual happens. Science is how God enacts miracles. It is literally like photosynthesis is a pure miracle, but we can explain it kind of through science, right? There are other things along the same line. The conception of life, we know kind of how it happens, but we cannot give you the fullness, right? There is a mingling of DNA. There are two souls that combine, but how that happens, we don't particularly know, right? We know the physical parts of that, not the spiritual parts, but they are intricately linked. There is no real separation. For your physical experience to have any physical experience, there has to be physicality to it. You cannot go as a soul and feel heat. You can get the impression of heat, but you do not have physical senses, right? If you do not have physical senses, what you are saying, you quite literally say there is no way to physically feel, but yet you're feeling heat. This is someone with an already determined idea, attempting to explain that idea in a way that kind of makes sense if you don't have the knowledge of science. And again, right, I did cast some aspersions on how we can become a doctor, but it is because of the lens of history that I can do that, right? We have the ability to see through the electron microscope and know how things work. We have telescopes to see deep into space and understand that the understanding was not there, right? We know a lot about heat. We have the ability to manipulate it these days. In his days, that was not true, right? We found phosgene gas during the First World War. That was because of refrigeration, which was just barely a thing, right? If you don't know, phosgene gas comes from the degradation of chlorofluorocarbons. If you heat up Freon, right, trademark Freon refrigerant, it turns into some pretty nasty things. Like if your AC unit, maybe not the new ones, right? We're using like 134 or 404A or something these days, but once upon a time it was R12, right? And if you have an R12 unit that got hot, really hot, right, 250 degrees plus, do not break that open. It will kill you. I mean, it has turned to mustard gas after 250 degrees. R12 breaks down into phosgene gas. It's one of the reasons why we quit using it, even though they're blaming the ozone, right? That was another one of those stupid things. And again, without understanding of how things actually work. There is no way at all that you feel heat as an etheric body with no physicality, frame of reference even, right? If there was not an incarnation, there is no frame of reference for an ego to have the sensation, right? There's no frame of reference, right? You are operating with a frame of reference that heat exists from the time of your birth. That is intrinsic to your world. There is no separation of your understanding of existence from the understanding of existence with heat being present. This is just an imagination exercise. This is somebody trying to explain something, but not necessarily having the technical means to do so in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. Every single part of this is almost certainly incorrect. And that is not to say that there are not other good parts in the book, but this part is pretty much dismissible. In a cosmic body of this character, there are no conditions for the animal, vegetable, and mineral organisms of today. The beings whose sphere of action was this Saturn were at quite a different stage of evolution from that of the present inhabitants of the Earth, who are perceptible to the senses. In the first place, there were beings there who had no physical body like that of contemporary man. We must also guard against thinking of man's present physical embodiment when mention is made of a physical body in this connection. We should instead carefully distinguish between the physical and the mineral body. What do you think the physical body is comprised of? What do you think that the physical body is made out of? It is quite literally minerals. A physical body is one governed by the physical laws which are now observable in the mineral kingdom. Now, man's present physical body is not only ruled by those physical laws, but is also permeated with mineral matter. Yes, there can be no question as yet of Saturn, of a physical mineral body of this kind. There is only... There is a question as to whether there was a physical mineral body on Saturn of any kind. Well, there was a question whether there was an etheric body on Saturn of any kind. There is a question whether there was an astral body on Saturn of any kind. And so there can be a question as yet of Saturn of a physical mineral body of this kind. There is only a physical body form, governed by physical laws, but these laws are manifested only through the agency of heat. And again, that is the exact wrong interpretation of what heat does. Heat is the resultant of the manifestation. Right? You being here is a manifestation from the spiritual world. Right? Your body is incorporated from the spirit, and it is only through the heat, it is only through the transformation that heat is generated. Therefore, the physical body is a fine, subtle, ethereal heat body, and the whole of Saturn consists of such heat bodies. They are the beginnings of the present physical, mineral human body. The latter has been formed out of the former because there have become incorporated with the original body the more recently formed gaseous, liquid, and solid substances. Among the beings of which we are now speaking, who besides men were inhabitants of Saturn, there were, for instance, some which did not need a physical body at all. The lowest principle of their nature was an etheric or vital body. On the other hand, they had one principle higher than the human principles. Man's highest principle is the spirit man, Atma. These beings have one still higher, and between the etheric body and the spirit man, they have all the principles described in this treatise, which are also found in man: the astral body, ego, spirit self, and life spirit. Just as our Earth is surrounded by an atmosphere, so too was Saturn. Only in this case, the atmosphere was of a spiritual nature. It really consisted of the beings just named and some others. Now, there was a constant reciprocal action between the heat bodies of Saturn and the beings we have described. The latter projected the principles of their being down into the physical heat bodies of Saturn, and while there was no life in those heat bodies themselves, the life of their neighbors was expressed in them. They might be compared to mirrors, only there were reflected in them not the images of the living beings mentioned above, but their conditions of life. Therefore, although nothing living could have been discovered in Saturn itself, yet it had a vivifying effect on its environment in celestial space, because it reflected back into space, like an echo, the life which had been sent down into it. The whole of Saturn appeared as a mirror of celestial life. The very high beings, whose life was reflected by Saturn, are called in occult science Lords of Wisdom. Their activity on Saturn was not just a beginning in the middle period of the evolution, which has been described. In a certain way, it had, even then, already ceased. Before they could be in a position to rejoice in the reflection of their own life from Saturn's heat bodies, they had to make those bodies capable of producing such a reflection. Therefore, their activity began soon after the beginning of the Saturn evolution. When this happened, the body of Saturn was still chaotic material which could not have reflected anything. And in contemplating this chaotic matter, one has transferred himself by spiritual observation to the beginning of the Saturn evolution. What is to be observed there does not as yet bear anything of the latter character of heat. If we wish to describe it, we can only speak of a quality which may be compared with the human will. From first to last, it is nothing but will. Therefore, it is an entirely spiritual condition that meets us here. If we ask whence came this will, we'll see it proceeding from the effluence of exalted beings, who brought their evolution by steps only to be dimly conceived, up to such a height that when the Saturn evolution began, they were able to pour forth will from their own being. When this effluence had lasted a certain time, the activity of the Lords of Wisdom, described above, was combined with this will. Through this means the will, which had hitherto had no attributes, gradually received the quality of reflecting life back into celestial space. In occult science, the beings who found their happiness in pouring forth will at the beginning of the Saturn evolution are called the Lords of Will. I do not believe any of this, right? I believe that God created all of us in our own specificity through his own direct will, and that there was no lords that were designated to do so. I can be wrong in that. Again, this is one of those things that can never be proven. But my experience has shown that these entities are present, but not as active as has been assumed. And so you can absolutely believe that there are lords of wisdom and lords of will and all of that, but to me, those are just going to be entities and not responsible for anything outside of their particular purview, right? If they are an entity dealing with fire, they're going to have some fire problems, but you're not going to be able to do anything with water, right? I don't believe that there was any create the human beings. I don't believe that there was any create an astral body beings. I don't believe that there was any create the earth beings. I believe that there was one being beyond our comprehension that did all of those things, and that was the divine itself, without any intervention, no intermediaries whatsoever being necessary to anything. Like, we can do things, but we're not the only way that those things can be done. Right? The things that we can do are replicatable by other people, and they can do that, and so it is not intrinsic upon us to create any particular thing. And I don't believe that they created some entity to create humans. later, right? I think that's something that we have decided in our anthropomorphication of God. After a certain stage of the Saturn evolution had been reached, through the cooperation of will and life, begins the influence of other beings who are also within Saturn's environment. These are the lords of motion. They have no physical or etheric body. Their lowest principle is the astral body. When the Saturn bodies have acquired the capacity for reflecting life, the qualities which have their seat in the astral bodies of the Lord of Motion interpenetrate that reflected life. In consequence of this, it appears as though expressions of feelings, emotions, and similar psychic forces have been cast out of Saturn into celestial space. The whole of Saturn appears like one animated being, manifesting sympathies and antipathies. These psychic manifestations, however, are by no means its own, but merely the activity of the Lords of Motion reflected back. Alright, we'll get to this break here. This also having lasted for a certain period, there begins the activity of yet other beings, that is, of the Lords of Form. Their lowest principle, too, is an astral body, but that body is at a different stage of evolution from that of the Lords of Motion. Whereas the latter communicate only general manifestations of feeling to the reflected life, the astral body of the Lords of Form operates in such a way that the manifestations of feeling are flung out into cosmic space as if they come from individual beings. It might be said that the Lords of Motion make the whole of Saturn appear as an animated being. The Lords of Form separate that life into individual living beings, so that Saturn now appears as a conglomerate of such psychic beings. Alright, I'm trying to get to the end of this Saturn part. We'll go ahead and do some more, I guess. Let us imagine, for the sake of illustration, a mulberry or blackberry, made up as it is of small individual berries. In a similar manner to clairvoyant vision, Saturn, during the period of evolution now being described, is made up of individual Saturn beings, which of course have neither life nor soul of their own, but reflect the life and soul of its denizens. Into this condition of Saturn now come beings whose astral body is also their lowest principle, but who have brought it to such a high stage of development that it operates in the same way as the present human ego. Through these beings, the ego in the environment of Saturn looks down on that planet and imparts its nature to Saturn's individual living beings. Thus, something is sent out from Saturn into cosmic space, which has an effect similar to that of human personality in the present conditions of life. The beings causing that effect are designated sons of personality. They confer on the Saturn bodies the appearance of personality. Personality itself, however, is not present on Saturn, but only, as it were, its reflected image, the shell or husk of personality. The real personality of these spirits is in the environment of Saturn. As a result of these sons of personality letting their essence stream back from the Saturn bodies in the manner described, that fine substance is bestowed on those bodies which has previously been described as heat. In the whole of Saturn there is no subjectivity, but the sons of personality recognize the image of their own subjectivity when it streams out to them from Saturn as heat. When all this is taking place, the sons of personality are on the same level on which man now stands. They are then passing through their human period, in order to look at this fact with an unprejudiced eye. We must imagine it possible for a being to be human without being in the exact form in which man now exists. So not human. The sons of personality are human beings on Saturn. They have as their lowest principle not the physical body, but the astral body with the ego. Hence, they cannot express the experiences of their astral body in such physical and etheric bodies as those of a contemporary man. They not only have an ego, however, but are aware of the fact because the heat of Saturn brings that ego streaming back into their consciousness. In fact, they are human beings under different circumstances from those of Earth, so not human. And this is going to be the beginning of a new evolution, and we'll start from there because we are already at an hour. And so that will bring us to the end of today's exploration of Chapter 4. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult topics. I understand I have some unconventional beliefs and a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something I apologize for. There are things that we can look back through the lens of history and get a greater understanding of. The transfer of heat is one of those things, right? There was a time when heat was considered a completely separate entity, and that is not entirely wrong. Plasma is a thing, and there are two stages of plasma, and understanding that can be a little bit hard, right? Plasma is quite literally everything, right? You are differentiated, but you are a differentiated piece of plasma, right? All the pieces of you are part of plasma, and the fact that you can be seen, right, the physical carnal part of you, is because of the changes occurring in you, the transfer of blood, right, the oxygen going into your cells and the waste products coming out is a transfer of heat energy, and it is visible. That's why you have all of these visible things. It is quite literally a manifestation of change occurring in your body, right? There is change happening in the inanimate objects on a lesser level, but still there. There is still entropy occurring inside of a pen or a pair of glasses. These bonds, all right, are formed, and the process of them forming is by heat exchange. Right? Heat is created through molecular disruption. It is transferred through a medium into another medium from the point of higher to lower. Again, you cannot make something colder, you can only remove heat from it. And when you put something cold next to something hot, it absorbs the heat from the cold absorbs the heat. The hot does not absorb the cold. There is a whole process by which that particular fact was proven. The fundamental misunderstanding of science is understandable. Science was playing out, right? But we cannot take, just because somebody did not have an understanding, we cannot assume that they were correct in their assumptions based on that misunderstanding. This entire section that we just did today is based entirely on a misunderstanding of how heat works. Every single piece of this was a complete misunderstanding of how it actually works, what thermodynamics actually are. I have studied that. It is one of the things I actually do hold a certification in. Now, I got that from the Navy, right? It was a course that I took in the Navy when I was an engineman, and I went to A school, and my A school was air conditioning, refrigeration, repair. I learned the laws of thermodynamics. I know how heat exchange works. I have done the experiments. And so I do have some knowledge on it. And I do have a greater knowledge than Mr. Steiner had. Now, he was working with the best information that he had, but he was definitely working with assumptions that he was making. You cannot make assumptions about new information and expect them to be right. You can make assumptions. It is always okay to speculate. It is through speculation that we gain new knowledge. But it has to be something you can test. It has to be something repeatable. There is nothing about this that has been independently corroborated at all. Every single person that was involved in this entire investigation of Saturn were already quite determined that this thing had happened. And so they saw exactly what they were expecting to see. One of them problems with prophecy that so often pop their head, right? Prophecy is not just looking into the future, it is seeing things unseen. Looking into the past, as they were attempting to do, is prophecy, and it is up to the same problems with prophecy as anything else. If you have a preconceived notion of how it's going to play out, that's exactly how it's going to play out. You can only explain things according to an understanding that you already have. You cannot explain things past your own understanding. And that's the entire problem with what we're seeing here. Is there good information in this book? Yes, we have found some good information already. But is there good information in this chapter? I don't know that we found any yet. And this is part 3? I mean, 3 hours in? And that's not very far, right? We're only like 16 pages in 3 hours because there's a lot here that has to be clarified, right? Now, has to be clarified is entirely up to my interpretation. That's what we're doing here, right? The things that I know about, I'm going to clarify. Heat exchange being a very good example of that. But several of the other things as well, right? There are things that I do know. There are things that I have done. And because I have done them, I do have a greater understanding than people who have not. Now, that is not to say that my understanding is complete. That is not to say that I am the end-all, be-all, know-all of anything. Take anything that I say with a grain of salt. If you buy the book, put it into practice. But don't assume that it is correct just because I wrote it down. I do, or else I would not have wrote it down. But even that is couched in correctability, right? I do plan on doing other additions to the book. As new information unfolds, we will revisit. We're about to be doing that on the channel right now. This is separate from the wrap-up, but for those of you who are here, you are the ones that are interested in this. We've already talked about the podcast, right? I do want to get into that. One of the things that I have been doing on this channel is setting up the groundwork, right? We've talked about the groundwork. We do the groundwork on all of these studies so that we understand who was doing the studies. I've been doing the groundwork on me, setting myself up as an expert, right? That is something I have been public with, where other people have been private with it. They do their studies in the comfort of their own home with no camera and lights and microphone. But I'm doing it publicly because I am setting myself up to be an expert in this field. I do have some knowledge. And one of the things that we're going to do is go back and review some of that knowledge before this podcast really picks up. I have 4 years of content, and we are not going to go through all of it, right? We're not going to go back through the reaction videos, but we are going to go back and together watch the Infinite Integrations playlist. We are going to go back together and see the parts of the Esoterica playlist that are not contained there, right? And with the greater understanding through the lens of history that we have had over the past couple of years, I'm going to go back through my ideas, probably in a live situation. Now, I'm working on the mechanics of how exactly I want to make that out, but I want to review my own information that I have put out there, clarify and do all of those things before we really dive into dealing with other people. Yes, Jason, I am still planning on getting you as a guest, right? But it may be a little while because I want to set this foundation, finish up these stories before we really dive deep into podcasting, because at that point, some of this is going to have to slack off, right? There won't be time for me to do the review if we're doing the podcast. Now, I do plan on continue doing studies with the podcast, but how exactly that's going to play out is still up for debate. But that's where we're going to wrap this up. I did want to let y'all know that there is plans in the work. I am working something out with progress for the channel. I do plan on doing the podcast. I do want to have guests. But I want to make sure that where I am is where I need to be before we start talking to other people, right? I don't want somebody to come back in 5 years and treat me like Mr. Steiner is getting treated today, because I didn't have an understanding that I needed, and maybe that will be clarified if we go through right now. There has been a lot of progress personally for me since this channel has started. Where I am now is not even remotely close to where it was when we began. It is two completely separate areas of understanding, and so I do expect to have some information in that to correct. Part of that is going to be to have that resource available, right? Some of the things about logos I can definitely explain better now than I could 3 years ago, about the manifestation process, about all of these things. And so it'll be a clarification process before we dive into the getting other people's input. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. Put it in the box down below, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of the book where I do teach you to do magic responsibly. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pit Steak. Peace.